All right, so welcome to class tonight. Thank you for being here. Let's start off in a word of prayer, and then let's get started. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for your faithfulness. We thank you for coming into this room, Lord, and being with us. Lord, we ask that you will open our minds and our understanding, that you will solidify concepts, Lord, that you will give us confidence, Lord, that you will give us wisdom in knowing how to use the history of your church to lead others to Christ. Lord, we just thank you for each person who is here. Lord, I thank you for their faithfulness to this course and to their studies. And Lord, I just ask that you would continue to guide and direct. And Lord, just be with each one. And we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. So, before we get started with the lecture, last week I was asked a question about when Galerius passed away, and I wasn't really able to answer it adequately. So, everything that's up on the board, this is just so that you can have a timeline. I am not going to quiz you over these dates and all of this, but this is what I needed to do in order to put my thoughts in order so that I could answer the question about Galerius's death. So this is strictly for your information. I mean, it's nice to have everything lined up this way so that, you can figure out who's on the east and who's on the west. But these dates, certainly I will not be quizzing you on the dates of each emperor's rule. That's over the top. We're not doing that. So remember that Decius was up here, and he was the 2 years of really heavy persecution. And then as the empire keeps having assassinations and people taking over and whatever, this man, Diocletian, he was a general in the Roman army, and he was very good at what he did. And after several wins, his soldiers and his companies basically elected, for what it's worth, him to be the emperor. And he came in, and you can read up on him. He's a fascinating man. But anyway, so Diocletian takes over the empire in 284. Within a couple of years, he appoints his Caesar to the west, Maximian. Okay. In 305, both Diocletian and Maximian, they did what they said they would do, and they abdicated their positions and stepped down, and their Caesars rose up. And so then Galerius became emperor in 305, and Constantius Chlorus, this is Constantine's dad, he became empire of the West in 305 when they abdicated, right? So then Galerius dies in 311. That's the answer to the question from last week. He died in 311, that very horrible death that we talked about. Constantius Chlorus, I actually didn't find a lot of information about him. One of the resources I read said that he died in battle, but I'm just not really sure that I'm going there. But anyway, for whatever reason, he's no longer emperor in 306. Then Constantine and Maxentius move up, and they become emperor. Maxentius in 312 meets Constantine just north of Rome along that Tiber River, and they have this battle at the Milvian Bridge. And remember, it's not really a bridge, it's a boat bridge where the boats are kind of lined up next to each other, and then there's this platform going across the front or the top of it. Anyway, so many of Maxentius's men died in that battle. Maxentius himself died in that battle in 312. Okay? Then Licinius, we very briefly talked about Licinius. This is Constantine's brother-in-law. They got along for a little while, were able to kind of work with each other. Constantine made it very clear that he was actually the final say across the board, but Licinius was ruling things in the east. So anyway, eventually they came at odds, and Constantine took out Licinius. And then after Licinius's death, Constantine is really the sole emperor over the entire empire. Okay? All right, so a couple of things to note besides the Milvian Bridge here with Maxentius. After Constantine took
control of the empire. So he took control in 306. By 313, that Edict of Milan came out. This was Milan is a city, by the way, but this edict came out, and this was the edict that officially declared Christianity a religion of the empire, right? So this is the official document that says Christianity is legal, no more persecuting the Christians, right? The other thing is, so just as a general idea, so up here with Decius, heavy persecution. Some persecution with Diocletian. By the end of his life, the last 2 years, heavy persecution. Galerius was all about persecution. He did it his whole life, except for his last couple of weeks or few weeks of his life. And then Constantine comes on the scene and makes Christianity legal, right? Well, by this era, by the time Theodosius takes over the Roman Empire, so I'm just trying to make a point here. I'm just not doing a good job. Heavy persecution up here. Christians are being killed for being Christians, right? Here, Christianity is made legal, and now not only are Christians coming out of hiding, but it's becoming prosperous to be a Christian, to get a good job, to get a good appointment, to marry into a good family, to blah, blah, blah. Being a Christian is advantageous, right? So now lots of people are Christians, right? Everyone wants to be a Christian now, even if they don't care about the doctrine or the theology. Everybody's a Christian, right? By the time we get to Theodosius, interestingly, now, if you do not become a Christian, if you are not a Christian, we're going to kill you. Right? So we go from being killed for being a Christian, it's okay to be a Christian, and now it's advantageous to be a Christian, to you better be a Christian or we're going to kill you. So Christians killing other Christians, and some of those were Christians killing Christians, but it doesn't matter, especially to the secular world. Whenever somebody outside is looking in on our history, they don't care if you are a real Christian or a fake Christian. It's just, at this point, Christians are killing Christians for not being Christians. It's crazy, right? And that's a pretty short time frame. That's a lot of action for a pretty short period of time. Okay? So anyway, hopefully that kind of clears or puts some things in order that helps them make a little bit more sense. All right. I don't know if I do that. All right, so let's start. I'm going to leave this up for as long as I can because I really like these dates being up here. I'm going to try to refer to some things and kind of put stuff into perspective using this. I may do some writing down here, but I'm going to try to keep this up if I can. All right, so the last lecture, we pretty much stopped at, after this, we stopped at the Nicene Creed being developed, right? So very briefly, in Alexandria, Egypt, there was the bishop, his name was Alexander, and then there was this man, Arius, right? Alexander is pastoring, he's giving a teaching, and Arius stands up and starts correcting him, so to speak, and starts to relay this idea that the Messiah is not from the beginning and until the end. Like, he is a created being that was created by God the Father. He starts talking about this. Well, Alexander is mortified. He's not impressed. And as a matter of fact, Alexander got a few of his bishops together from other cities, like up in Rome and some other places like that. They had a small get-together, like 100 or so, I think. Pastors got together, discussed this, and declared within themselves, Arius a heretic, right? Now, while all this is happening, Constantine has already taken over the empire, right? And he wants, as the sole emperor, he wants to unify all of the empire. He wants the fighting to stop, the backbiting, the this and the that. And he's decided to use Christianity as one of his primary tools. A universal religion for a unified empire. All of this stuff that's happening in Alexandria with the bickering and the fighting and the little councils and the you're a heretic and the all the stuff that's happening is not fitting with his plan. Constantine is not impressed that within his empire, the unifying tool is at odds within itself, right? So then that's why he calls this council. Now, if you guys have this map with you, it will be helpful. If you don't, that's okay. I can pass this around so you can see it. But up here toward where the Black Sea is, which is not listed, of course, you have Turkey. And then you have this, where these two little pieces of land come together right here. That's basically where Byzantium is, okay? I don't know if you can, yeah. So this little area right here, where these two pieces of land are coming together, that's basically Constantinople, or where the old Byzantium was, that's now Constantinople. So this little area right here, where these two land structures are, okay, so here's Turkey. These two land masses where they're coming together, Byzantium is in this area. It's along that trade route, right?
Here, it's on here.
Yes, it's on a different map. It's actually on one of your other maps. So what I wanted to point out to you is that just south and, let me make sure I have it right, east, just south and east of Constantinople or Byzantium, that's Nicaea. That's where he had a summer home. That's where he had his, that's where he paid to have all of these pastors from all over the empire, he being Constantine, paid for all of these bishops all over the empire to come up to Nicaea, which is just outside of Constantinople, and meet for this huge pastors' conference, right? So they come together, they meet, Arius shows up, a few of his friends show up, they have their debates. There are other things, like if you look up the history of this council, there were other things that were addressed, but primarily it was called to address the Arian heresy because there was too much fighting going on, too much conflict about him. So it was called because of him, but they had other things on the agenda. Anyway, at the end of the council, what was ruled was that Christ was actually a God that had no beginning, a God that has no end, is synonymous with the Father, and is not a created being by the Father. So Arius was declared a heretic, officially declared a heretic from that council, and this Nicene Creed, which I was desperately looking for, is in your book. Thank you very much. The Nicene Creed was created. It's on page 109 of your book. You can look or not look, but the one line, or there's several things that directly attack the Arian heresy, but the line that is clearest, at least to me, is, so I'll just start from the top. It's not very far in. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all worlds, God of God, light of light, very God of very God. This is it. Begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. So that line dispels any idea that Jesus was a created God. Because he was begotten, he was not made. And he is one substance with the Father, and the Father is eternal. So this Nicene Creed was developed specifically to combat, or it was created to express the official church position with regard to Arian. Officially a heretic, and that's sort of the answer to his heresy. Okay? So that's basically where we left off last week. So, now, this week, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back as far as the timeline, okay? We're going to take a little bit of a step back, and we're going to discuss something that's called the monastic lifestyle. Monastic just means the monk's lifestyle, okay? This lifestyle had been developed prior to Diocletian. It was a concept that came from the the term hermit, which means desert, because many times the people who chose a monastic lifestyle would separate themselves from the cities and go out into the desert by themselves and live all by themselves, all alone, right? So why would they do that? There are two primary reasons that they did these things. So at this time, just like throughout all of history, there were very faithful and fervent men in general, but people who were members of the church. The churches in different places, different times for different reasons, would end up with some sort of corruption. It could be money, it could be bribery, it could be inappropriate relationships, whatever. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. But some kind of corruption enters the church. So these faithful people who are probably attending these churches, they're seeing the corruption and they're like, what are we going to do? I don't know, because they don't want to leave the church. They don't want to pull out of the church. On the other hand, or also, it's not really on the other hand, but in addition to that, these people were facing the same things that all of us face very likely on a daily basis. They have temptations that they have to deal with. Temptations of lust or overindulgence of some sort, or maybe hatred. I mean, whatever. They just have issues with temptation. So these very fervent people, all they really, really want is to have a close relationship with God. They want to study, they want to pray, they want to know God. But they have these problems. I mean, they're going into their churches and some of them are corrupt. They're not in their churches and they're being faced with all of this temptation. They just don't know how to handle things, right? But they don't want to leave the church. That's very important. They have no intention of turning their back on God just because there's corruption here or they're having issues with living in the world, right? So the answer to that was this monastic lifestyle. They not pulled away from God, but pulled away from the temptation. They removed themselves from the temptation. It's very similar to how Pastor Khan describes donuts as being sin. Like, whatever your sin is, it's a donut. And if you have a problem with donuts, don't go to a donut shop. It's kind of the same idea. These guys didn't want to destroy the church or leave the church or damage the church. They just wanted to pull away from all of the stuff that was distracting them. So they went out and they isolated themselves. And often, these things started, I believe, in Egypt. They would leave these cities, and you didn't really have to go very far in either direction, and you would hit very serious desert. So it was easy to get into a monastic lifestyle from that Egyptian peninsula. So, now, remember whenever we were talking, this has been several weeks back, when we were talking about Ignatius and Polycarp and all those early church fathers and the persecutions that were happening at the time, and how very faithful people were being martyred, and it was becoming so intense, or however you want to describe it. It was becoming, martyrdom itself was becoming such a thing that people were going out and trying to get themselves martyred, right? They were running to martyrdom. Things sort of settled down because Constantine came on the scene. There was no martyrdom, no need for martyrdom anymore because Christianity is good, right? But you still had these pockets of people who were just having issues surviving inside of their world and staying faithful. In their own mind, they couldn't stay here and stay faithful to God, right? So this monastic lifestyle became very popular, but it also almost became a substitute for that. Instead of rushing to martyrdom to show how faithful and fervent you are for Christ, you could go into a monastic, relationship, a monastic lifestyle, and show your fervency for Christ. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's just an idea. It almost became something that some people went after in order to prove something. Maybe just to themselves. It may not even be to anybody else. It may just be to themselves. So on top of being monastic, these extra fervent people had another title to describe their lifestyle. It's called ascetic. So it's an ascetic monastic lifestyle, okay? This ascetic lifestyle, you can have an ascetic lifestyle without being a monk, okay? An ascetic lifestyle is one that is practicing very strict self-denial. And the reason that you're practicing this very strict self-denial is to measure your personal and spiritual discipline. So you're basically proving your worth and your girth toward Jesus by the extent of self-denial that you can put on yourself. So the monks, they left to avoid temptation, to get away from the corruption, and to isolate themselves so that they could focus. The ascetics, and by definition, when you're leaving the city and you're going into the desert, you're living in a cave, you're living in a man-made habitation of some sort, or you're just sleeping under the stars if it's warm, whatever. But I mean, you have no food source, you have no water source, you have nothing. And so you have to figure out how to survive. You have to be in a place where you can catch animals, where you can find rainwater, where you can, whatever. You have to figure out how to survive, right? So there's already a measure of self-denial that goes into pulling out of society, living all by yourself, and figuring out how to survive. Right? These guys took it a little bit further. They just sort of expanded on it. These are the people who would, we were talking about Martin Luther before class. He was a monk prior to his upcoming as the Reformation leader. Actually, we're going to talk about Augustine. He was an Augustinian monk. But he used to, by the time he was a monk, they had cloisters, which we're going to talk about in a minute. They had like communities, and they were living inside of buildings. But he would sleep on a stone cold floor naked in the dead of winter to try to freeze out the thoughts and the intentions of his mind and of his flesh. So it's not, living out on your own, you could get cold even if you were covered, but this was the person who, for example, might purposely make himself very, very cold for the purposes of killing the flesh. Okay? Now, did anybody know he was doing that? Well, obviously we have records of it, but in general, he wasn't doing it. My point is, he's not doing it to show off for everybody else, to show how good he is. It's really to fight his own demons. Because so you have all of these temptations and things that are going on because the world is the world and people are people. But when you're out all by yourself, you have no one to pray for you. You have no support as far as studying the scriptures with somebody, discussing the scriptures. You have nobody to pray for. Other than the people that you knew before you left. You don't even know what's going on with them, though. It's just general prayer. You are fighting for survival, right? And these guys just lived on a whole different plane of self-denial is really not what I want to say. They truly deprived themselves of everything. So, for example, an ascetic monk, even the non-ascetic monks, but almost all of them were ascetic anyway. But these guys, they would have a measure of food, however it was that they got their food, and they would eat only enough to be satisfied in that moment, and then they would either give it away, other people, they would find other people give it away, or they would put it away. They would never finish a meal, and they would only eat whenever their body told them it was time to eat, which is probably a good idea for us in general. But anyway, so these guys just were pretty extreme. Now, some of the things that came out of this lifestyle, these guys had religious enthusiasm. They were very ambitious. They had lots of time for study, prayer, contemplation. They felt, at least at the beginning, and sometimes just intermittently throughout the time that they practiced this, they felt a sense of freedom because they weren't bound by any societal laws or people just coming down and judging them or whatever. So they felt very free. They felt free from temptations of the city. But like I said, when you're all by yourself and you have nothing but your own thoughts to deal with, that brings in temptations all of their own. So people would perhaps remember previous relationships and they're all by themselves, like intimate relationships, and they would be suffering because they were being tempted by what they were missing, or the love they had for somebody, or the meal they had that one time at the banquet, or whatever. And those things, they would yearn for that, and then they would feel as though they needed to be punished because they were giving in to a sort of temptation that was not necessary. None of that is necessary. God is necessary. Study and prayer is necessary. So they tend to sometimes have pride come up inside of them because they are living this way, and they would sometimes, and this is completely human, they would sometimes think, well, I'm living this righteous lifestyle. I'm doing this for Christ. I'm self-denying. I'm this, I'm that. And instead of it being a sacrifice to Christ, it becomes something prideful that they're taking credit for. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's another temptation. Many of these writings from the monastic, the ascetic monks, talk about battling actual demons. Now, I don't know that that's in the flesh, but definitely spiritual warfare. Lots and lots of battles going on with these guys, and them trying to come up with some way to punish themselves in a way that would kill that part of their flesh, that would kill that part of their desire. So it was a constant battle. Being a monk was not a walk in the park. It had many, many challenges, but these men that's just what they wanted to do. This idea of asceticism, it actually dates back. I don't know if I told you guys this when we were talking about Origen. Did I tell you that it's thought, there's a little bit of a conflict, but most things when you read about Origen say that he castrated himself in order to avoid any sort of sexual temptation. He became a eunuch so that he could not have that temptation anymore. I don't know if I told you guys that or not. Well, it's believed that he did. So even back in the times of Origen and before, there was this idea of going the extra mile in order to fill in the blank, prove how much you love Christ, keep temptations from you. So these guys didn't pull away from society, but they did things in order to combat whatever their temptation was. So it's a natural progression. You can think of it as a natural progression to go from that to, we just got to get away and go be by ourselves and just be with God, right? So that's what happened. Many people thought of this lifestyle, like I told you earlier, as a voluntary sort of martyrdom. They looked at it, we can't die for Christ, but we can self-deny to the point where we prove our love for Christ, sort of thing. So they called it voluntary martyrdom. All right, so that's kind of the background for what are monks and what is this ascetic lifestyle. All right, so let's talk about a couple of the monks. Oh, all right, so this date is more because you're not going to have to know this date. I'm just kind of putting it into a timeline with all of this. So in 270, there was a man named Anthony of Egypt. He is, like I said, he's in Egypt, and I don't know if you guys on your maps, this map that Leela had is a good one. This area, let's see, I'm upside right here. So here's Egypt and the Nile River. And then here's the Red Sea, and you have these two like rabbit ears worth of land coming up. All right, so here's the Nile River, and if you go this direction, you end up in the Sinai Desert. And some of them went this direction too, but this area of the Sinai Desert was very much a favored. So there's the Nile River, and then here's the Red Sea, and so it was a very short walk to get from the city and where all of the lush, produce and everything that came from the Nile into this area where there was really nothing. So it didn't take a lot of effort for the monks who at least started out in Egypt along the Nile River. Here's the Red Sea, and then these two landmasses, they just had to go a little bit one direction. They could go the other direction too, but this is the Sinai Wilderness right here.
Yeah, the pointed one.
Right. So a bigger map, there's the Nile River, and then it didn't take too much effort to get into the desert of Sinai. So, and you could get yourself to a point where you were kind of far away from both the water sources. So, all right, so the reason I'm telling you that is because we're going to talk a little bit of specifics about some of these monks. Okay, so Anthony. Oh, sorry, thank you. All right, so Anthony. He was one of those people that left the cities of Egypt and headed toward the Sinai. He was, just a little bit of background about him. He was born to a very wealthy family. He himself is thought to have been illiterate. They didn't think that he could write or read. I guess reading is the bigger deal. And but he grew up in a household where the scriptures were studied and taught, and so he actually memorized thousands of scriptures just from being in a home that was constantly going through them. And so he couldn't, it's thought, even though that he couldn't read, he really had a strong grasp on the scriptures. They said that his library was his head, because he just was he had a phenomenal memory. So never learned to read, never learned to write. When he was 18 years old, his parents died, and so he suddenly had he was the sole caregiver for his large estate, because they were a wealthy family, this large estate, and his little sister. Well, he's doing the best he can, and he goes and listens to this teaching, and it's about 6 months after his parents died, he hears a sermon where what is taught is, go and sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. So he takes that to heart. He sells almost everything he has, gives all of that to the poor, but keeps back a measure to take care of himself and take care of his sister. Well, about 3 weeks later, he hears another sermon that says, well, don't worry about tomorrow. God is in control. Don't worry about tomorrow. So he goes ahead and sells everything else he has and gives it all to the poor. And he takes his sister and drops her off with some church women. They called them pious virgins. I don't quite understand the whole idea. It's almost like a nunnery, it sounds like, but I don't really understand what that is. But it was a collection of church ladies. He dropped his sister off with these ladies for her caregiving, and he decides to go into the desert and start this monastic lifestyle. He was criticized for leaving his sister, but that's what he did. When he left, he went into that Sinai Peninsula for about 3 years, and he lived in an old decomp cave. So it's where people would take the dead to have them, outside the city, to have them go ahead and continue to deteriorate. He lived in one of those decomp caves. He fought and fought and fought with his own personal demons. Just really had heavy spiritual warfare those first 3 years. Much of it was about money. He came from a wealthy family, came from privilege, came from comfort, and now he's having to fight, some of his upbringing. He was tortured with his spiritual warfare, saying, man, you had everything and you're so stupid, you gave it all up, and now look at you, and you don't even know where your sister is, whatever, it's those kinds of thoughts, those self-defeating thoughts that we all have. He was all by himself. Again, no prayer support, nobody to help support him in any way, and he's just by himself in a decomp cave. That's depressing, and trying to get past all these things that he's doing. Oh, I bet it did. Whew, I bet it did. So, I guess depending on how recently it had been used, yeah, that's true. So, So he decided to go, after that first 3 years, he decided to go deeper into the Sinai desert. Okay, so he moves from where he was and he continues deeper into the desert. He ends up being, and this is why I showed you the map, he ends up being a 3-day journey from the Nile River and a 7-hour journey from the Red Sea. So he was, I'm assuming he went around the small bit of water that was there, but I don't know, the Red Sea that comes up. But anyway, however he got there, he was 3 days from the Nile, but 7 hours from the Red Sea. So he kind of camped out in the middle of the desert. He lived in a tomb, in the tombs of a castle. I'm assuming it was abandoned for 20 years. He slept on the bare ground of this castle. He ate only bread, no meat. He didn't drink wine, which was a big, no wine, no meat. He only drank water. He never washed his feet. That's crazy. Never washed his feet. And he continued to have very difficult battles, spiritual battles. There were other hermits or monastics. Oh, I keep pointing to this and I erased the word. There were other people living this lifestyle that were in the general area. And he would share his food, his leftover food with other people. And I mean, it was almost like a very spread out community. They still were very individualized, but there was some contact with other people that were living this lifestyle. He was striving for spiritual perfection, which is what most of these guys were doing. They were striving to be spiritually perfect. And so they would pray without ceasing, and they believed if you didn't work, you shouldn't eat. So all of them labored for their own survival, but still continued to help each other in different times. I always think of helping each other, like if someone becomes ill, if someone is hurt, trying to catch food or falling off of the top of a cliff or a mountain or something. If someone is hurt, I imagine that they rallied and helped until somebody got back on their feet. But if you just went out into the desert and hung out, there's not going to be any of that. So interestingly, poor Anthony, he went out into the desert to be by himself, to be alone with God, but he was so prolific in his teaching and his wisdom that many times the other people would come to him and ask for help or prayer or whatever wisdom he had, they'd kind of come after him. He has a friend whose name is Athanasius, not a name you need to know. Athanasius wrote his biography, and I just want to read a little bit of what he put in his biography based on what I just told you about how he was living. From this short narrative, you may judge how great a man Anthony was, who persevered in the ascetic life from youth to the highest age. In his advanced age, he never allowed himself better food, not a change of raiment or clothing, nor did he even wash his feet. Yet he continued healthy in all his parts. His eyesight was clear to the end, and his teeth were sound, though by long use worn to mere stubs. He retained also the perfect use of his hands and feet, and was more robust and vigorous than those who are accustomed to change of food and clothing and to washing. His fame spread from his remote dwelling on the lone mountain over the whole Roman Empire. What gave him his renown was not learning, worldly wisdom, human art, but alone his piety toward God. And then he goes on to talk about monks and their relationship with God. So he actually became quite famous throughout the Roman Empire for his wisdom and his lifestyle and his pious nature toward God. Became famous enough that Constantine heard of him. Constantine knew who Anthony was. So Constantine actually wrote him a letter, sent him a letter. Well, Anthony couldn't read it because he can't read. So what he did the people who brought him the letter, he just gave it, or I don't know if he kept it or gave it back, but he didn't open the letter. And he said, I'm not going to read it, but send this back to Constantine and tell him, basically, don't be too excited about being emperor. Be more excited about being a child of God. That's where your focus should be, is not running this empire, but being a faithful servant of God. So it was interesting, his only reaction to the letter that he never even read, doesn't even know the contents, was make sure that you don't get too big. Remember who you are in the Lord. It's interesting. So this man, Anthony, he is considered to be the first monk. By most, if you Google who was the first monk, you may get other answers. But for our purposes, Anthony is the first monk. First monk. All right. So Anthony, he has a far-reaching influence. Okay. So around 320, there was a man who was a contemporary of Anthony's. His name was Pachomius. That name is not important either, just Pachomius. He was about 40 years younger than Anthony was, but still a contemporary. This guy was in the military. Interestingly enough, he was in Maxentius's army, and he was one of the survivors of the Milvian Bridge battle. Okay? It's very interesting. So he was a soldier. Pachomius, he was a career military man, but after he retired, he moved back to Egypt and, of course, heard of Anthony and all of his renown. So this Pachomius is a Christian. Okay.
Please.
Sure. Pachomius. Pachomius. All right, so this guy's a Christian. He knows who Anthony is. And what he decides that he's going to adopt this monastic lifestyle, okay? Now, he does something very interesting. He is the first person who actually brought some order to the monastic lifestyle. So instead of just kind of willy-nilly going out and setting up and figuring out, you're on your own, figure it out, he put some organization, and it makes sense because he's a military guy. That's what he does, is organize, right? So he begins to take these individual people in whatever area, and he begins to form what are called cloisters. Cloisters. That's just a group of monks, a group of people, okay? He begins to form them, and as they form this sort of small community, so to speak, he begins to organize them and say, okay, everyone who lives in this cloister, this is going to be what you're going to do every day. You're going to wake up at this time. You're going to pray for this long. You're going to eat at this time. You're going to go work at this time. You're going to do this. And he figured out a schedule so that it's kind of like, have you guys heard of, in Israel, they're not really the same as they used to be, but they have, why can't I think of what they're called? We stayed at them.
Kibbutz.
The kibbutz, thank you. Have you heard of a kibbutz? Okay, so it's basically a place. This woman that I know learned Hebrew in a kibbutz several years ago. She went into Israel not knowing the language at all, and she went into this community, and it's very similar to this. And they have communities here. Sometimes they call them communes, but that usually has a negative sort of weird religious tone to it. But anyway, what she did was she went into this community that was already established, and in order to be there, you had to work in order to earn your keep. And then in the afternoon, they did like 4 hours of Hebrew or something like that. So she worked in the morning and then studied in the afternoon, and then, I don't know, I guess maybe passed out at night because it sounds really rigorous, but that's how the community survived. Like, if you didn't do your part, you didn't eat. If you didn't, and you were given the job you were given was the job that you were good at. So if you were good at cooking, that's what you did. If you were good at cleaning, that's what you did. If you were good with kids, that's what you did. If you were good at manual labor, that's what you did, because they raised their own food. They, if necessary, purified their own water. I mean, everything is self-sustaining. That's what these guys were. And that's what he did. He would take, this is your gift, so this is what you do. This is your gift, and this is what you do. But as a community, we're going to focus on prayer. We're going to focus on survival. We're going to focus on, helping the poor. We're going to organize this thing. So that's what he did. He was the first person to sort of organize these individual people into a community of sorts. Okay? All right. The three things that he emphasized in his cloisters were poverty, chastity, and obedience. Those are the three key concepts that he emphasized if you were going to live in a cloister that he organized. You take a vow of poverty, you take a vow of chastity, and you take a vow of obedience. Okay?
That's like the nuns now.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, it's all based around it's the same history. So, all right. Interestingly, after Anthony dies, because remember, Pachomius is about 40 years younger than him. So after Anthony dies, Pachomius takes a copy of his biography and takes off with two other people, monks, and they head to Rome. They go into Rome. And when they come into the city, he would remember that he was a soldier in Maxentius's army. So when he came into the city and he told them who he was, they knew him. And the city was like, this retired Roman soldier is in the city. So he and his two friends, whenever they realized who he was and blah, blah, what they wanted to do was show them all the features of Rome. Like, take them to dinner and a movie and show them Rome off to them and just really give them the full tour based on who he was as a retired Roman soldier, right? Well, he wasn't interested in doing any of that. What he did instead, he was dressed in very humble clothing, and what he and his friends did was basically pass around this biography of Anthony and talk about what the wisdom and the teachings, so to speak, that Anthony put out, talked about his lifestyle. And, of course, the people of Rome were just kind of like, whew, guy's a little bit crazy. He doesn't want to go to dinner. He wants to talk about a monk, So they didn't reject him, but they just weren't sure what his end game was. They didn't really know how to handle him. But he and his two friends stayed in Rome for about a year. And they just did not succumb to the Roman lifestyle at all. They stayed true to their own lifestyle while living in the city. And it is estimated that in the time that they were there, anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 Romans left Rome and entered monasteries in the desert. And granted, Rome's a huge city, but I'm just telling you, 2,000 to 10,000. They did not convert, but they had many converts. It was said at one time that so many people went into the desert that there were more people living in the deserts than there were living in the cities of Egypt. Who knows? It's just, but it's just, the point is there were lots and lots of people that were going for it, right? All right. So that's Anthony. And that's Pachomius. So the book mentions another important monk very briefly. I'm just going to talk about him briefly because the book actually tells you more about him than I'm going to. But this man named Jerome, okay? He was converted in Rome. He entered the ascetic lifestyle and the book tells you a little bit more about this, but he had a brief but unsuccessful stint in a monastery in the Syrian desert. Didn't work out. So he ended up going into Bethlehem. And he was very, very bright. He was a scholar. And so he began to look at and study the Septuagint. So do you remember what the Septuagint is? That is the Greek translation, right?
70 books.
Yes. It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, okay? Which is what they had, because the Greek society was, if you think back to Jerusalem falling and then going into Antioch and the mixed race church and the influence of the Hellenists and all that stuff, the Septuagint came from that whole time period. Well, he starts studying this, and he's having his own issues. Like, he has all these temptations, just like we all do. He's got all these temptations he's trying to fight. And so one of the ways that he chose to occupy his time was to learn Hebrew and then translate that Septuagint into Hebrew. Okay? So, well, it had to be the New Testament because the Old Testament's already in Hebrew. Anyway, so he starts learning Hebrew, and he becomes fluent, and he begins to translate. And this translation is called the Latin Vulgate. The reason it's called the Vulgate is because so you've heard Pastor Kahn talk about the language at the time of Jesus he doesn't just say Greek, he calls it Koine Greek. It's the sort of dialect or whatever of Greek that was spoken at the time. Vulgate Latin was the type of Latin that was spoken at the time, so that's why they called it the Latin Vulgate, because it was describing the type of Latin language that was used. So anyway, he began to translate the scriptures, and it was adopted by many of the churches at the time, and is still in circulation today. And interestingly enough, one of the things that he said was that the Apocrypha, those 12 to 15 history books, was not included in the original Hebrew text, but it was included in the Greek text. And remember, I don't know if you'll remember this or not, because it was kind of a detail that was kind of up there, but remember, Antioch was the center of Christianity after the fall of Jerusalem. The further you got away from Antioch, the more often the Apocrypha was included in the scriptures that they were using in the churches. So the closer to the literal translation, no Apocrypha. But the further you got, i.e. Rome, the Apocrypha ends up, and like 12 to 15 just depends on how they divide it up. So he is one of the people that said it was not in the original scriptures, but it was in the Greek scripture. So, for what it's worth. All right. So, once Pachomius started forming these cloisters, other men came up behind him. Can I erase this? Are you guys done with this part down here? All right. So, two more men that I want to talk about real quick. Super quick. One is a man named Benedict, and the other is Augustine. We're going to talk just real briefly about these guys. They're exceptionally important, especially Augustine, as we move further along in history, but we want to just talk about them in terms of those cloisters being developed. So, Benedict was a Roman citizen, or he grew up in Rome, and when he was 15, it was interesting, he made a decision at 15 to leave Rome and go into the outskirts of Rome, not into the desert country, but just into the outskirts of Rome, and begin to live this lifestyle, because all of his friends, all they cared about was drinking and dating and doing all these things that he didn't feel was the appropriate way to behave, and he just didn't have, what else was he going to do? His friends were doing things he didn't want to do. He had no place else to go or nothing else to do, so he could either join them or he could become a monk. So basically, he left the city and began to live in some caves that were outside the city. He had, like all the other monks that you read about, many, many battles within his spiritual warfare within his own mind. He had temptations that matched all of the other monks. You just can't go off all by yourself and spend so much time alone. Your thoughts just really, it just starts messing with you. Now, Benedict took this cloister idea, and he further developed it. And what he did is he said that we should have 12 monks to a cloister, with one person being a leader. Okay? 12 monks, one leader. What they did the same thing that the people in the Sinai desert tried to do, but they just had a little bit more fertile ground to work with. They had fields that they would plant and plow and harvest and use them to survive, but also use them to feed the poor. They emphasized prayer. They emphasized going out to neighbors because, again, they weren't living out in the middle of nowhere the way that the Egyptian monks were. They were living just outside the city. So then they would go to their neighbors and they would use whatever they could as an opportunity, basically like the Great Commission. They would use whatever opportunity they could to go out and talk to people about who God is and why they live the way they live. So the way that he set this up, like the number of people, what they did, how they lived, how they survived, how they spent their time outside of, not only just surviving for themselves, but actually working for the community to give back to the community that they're sort of living outside of. This was called the Benedictine rule. Okay? That's what sorry, I can't write and say this at the same time. The Benedictine rule. So, for example, if I decided that I wanted to join a Benedictine monastery, then what I would do is walk in the doors, and what I would be given is the Benedictine rules. This is how, if you choose to be here, this is how you're going to live, this is what you're going to do, this is going to be your life. And it still all revolves around that poverty, chastity, obedience guideline, okay? Now, there are several different kinds of orders of monks. You've heard of the Benedictine order maybe. You've heard of the Augustinian order. They have the Francis of Assisi order. They have the St. Basil order. They have lots of different orders. Benedict was one of the first to further organize. So you just had individuals, then you had Pachomius come in and sort of organize things a little bit in the desert. Then you had Benedict further organize. Okay? All right. It was very interesting. His set of regulations, this is very interesting. So what he did, he wanted to have a balance of life. He wanted to make sure that you worked hard to, earn your survival or earn your place in the monastery, but he wanted that equally balanced with your spiritual growth. So what he did is, instead of like having a flat out, okay, at this time you're praying, at this time you're doing this, and this time, there was that kind of order too, but instead of it being so strict, what he did was, in the times of harvest, the emphasis was on laborious work, and you still prayed and you still went to church and you still did other things, but that was less. Your time was spent, less of your time was spent doing that during the times of harvest, because you needed more time to harvest, right? But in the times of the winter, when the harvesting wasn't happening, then it would flip, and you would do much less in the labor area, and you would focus on your spiritual labor. So at the end of the day, you ended up having this nice balance of physical growth as well as spiritual growth. Does that make sense? So his idea was to create a more logical or reasonable balance to the monasteries. The other thing he did was, let's say that I decided I wanted to join, as a man, wanted to join this monastery. So what his rule was is that, yes, you're welcome to come in and you can stay in the monastery for 1 year. You can learn how we work, what we do, what's involved, what it means to take these vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, whatever. And after that 12 months, if you agree to stay in the monastery, then you have agreed to stay in for life. Like, it's all or nothing. You're either in the monastery or not that they would kill, I was going to say, or you die, but not that they kill you. But it was expected to be a lifetime commitment. So that's what people did. They would come in, they'd check it out, and if you decided to leave in any time within that 12 months, no questions asked, no judgment, no chastising, no rumors of who couldn't cut it and why they couldn't cut it. It was simply, it's not for you, and you walked away free and clean. But after you joined, the expectation was that you would be a lifetime member. Okay? Let's see. So the cloisters themselves, interestingly enough, because they ended up having wealthy people give them land. Because remember, these guys were giving back to the community. They were using the land that they were being given to harvest and whatever, and they were giving back to the community. Well, they kept getting donations, sometimes land, sometimes money, whatever they were getting. So the monasteries actually became very wealthy. The people who lived in the monastery, dirt poor, nothing. They had, just the simple clothing that they needed to be covered and be decent. They had, again, enough food to satisfy themselves and no more. They still lived this very strict lifestyle within the monastery, but the monastery itself was quite wealthy. If you were to take that land or whatever it is that's in there and sell it, it was actually worth quite a bit of money. So it was interesting that that it was such a wealthy yet poor situation. This leader, he was called an abbot. Is it A-B-B-O-T-T or A-B-O-T-T? A-B-B-O-T. I knew. That's a title, kind of like pastor or whatever. He was the abbot of the monastery or the cloister. This abbot, when you join the monastery, part of the vow of obedience was absolute, unconditional obedience to the abbot. What the abbot said went, with the understanding that when a major decision needed to be made, he would call a meeting of all of the monks and pull them in and ask for overall advice. It wasn't a vote, it wasn't a democracy, it wasn't anything like that, but he would call in the members of the monastery that would be affected by this huge decision that would be made, and he would take in all of the things that people had to say prior to making the absolute decision that once it was made, they were obligated by vow to support and to honor. The other thing, so no major decisions without at least the consultation of the other members. And the other thing is, to get this position, you're voted in by, or chosen, I keep saying voted, you're chosen by the members of the cloister. So if you're some crazy dude, you're not going to get chosen. You know what I'm saying? So it was Benedict's way of balancing power. This guy has absolute power, but is required to take in information from his cloister and is only put in this position by his cloister. Okay? And just, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Black Friars. They were the monks that wore the black when they were out. Anyway, that's where that term came from, was from these Benedictines, because they wore these black hooded covers. Like sometimes in the movies you'll see exaggerations, or it's kind of making fun of them, but you'll see them, walking around with, you can't see any part of them and they're all covered. Those are the Black Friars, and I don't know that they were necessarily all that, dramatic about it, but you can see at least somebody's rendition of what they looked like in the movies. They did have set prayer times every day, one of which was 2:00 in the morning. Everyone got up at 2:00 in the morning and prayed. It was a prayer and worship time. They were very regimented, but like I said, they had changes in regiment based on the season. All right, so these monks, I'm not going to have time to talk about Augustine. We'll have to talk about him next time. So the monks are very important for how the church has developed and where we are today. This 1,000-year period, which we haven't even gotten to yet, the 1,000 years from the fall of Rome until the period of the Renaissance, so we haven't quite gotten there yet, but that 1,000 years, the monks are a very important part of that history, because in all of the wars and the this and the that were going on, the monasteries were basically not touched. They weren't ravaged by war, and they were very scholarly. So many They had libraries of books that were kept inside the monastery for one reason or another. And whenever there were these total wipeout of country around these monasteries, lots and lots of culture and literature were preserved because they were kept safe within the monasteries. So many of the things that we have access to today are because these monasteries were also scholarly. So that's good. Khan did mention this. I think it was him, and one of his, Pastor Khan mentioned this in one of his lectures very, very recently, or teachings. I keep calling it a lecture, it's teaching. This period of time between the fall of Rome and the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, depending on your perspective, you called it something different. Okay? So you have the Middle Ages. This is just for fun. I mean, if I were to put something like this on the test, it would be a bonus question. It's not. So you have what's known as the Middle Ages. You have what's known as the Dark Ages. And you have what's known as the Golden Age. All of these refer to the same time period, okay? And again, this is way in the future. We haven't gotten there yet. I'm just giving you a little bit of trivia. The Middle Ages, this is from the perspective of historians. It's just called the Middle Ages. It's the age between this and this, so it's a middle age, right? So this is... historians call this the Middle Age, and they document changes of government and politics and just general history. This same age, if you are of the intellectual society, like schools or whatever, they call the same time frame the Dark Ages, because this is the time when religion ruled for the most part, and as does happen with most things. Once something comes into power, it starts off being, fairly decent, and then, just kind of somehow gets a little bit crazy. And then the Golden Age, this is basically the perspective of the church, the Catholic Church. So from the church's perspective, we were, as the church, we were sort of running things. From the intellectual's perspective, what happened to the culture and the politics and the beautiful things that were going on in the world. This is the Dark Ages, whenever Christianity was in charge, so to speak. And then the Middle Ages is just basically telling the story. But it's all the same time period. So when you read stuff, realize that they're not three different periods. They're just three different perspectives of the period. Okay? So that's just trivia. All right. We will talk about Augustine next time. Hold on, let me make sure. Yeah. I do have it written down. Septuagint is the Old Testament. I was right the first time. I shouldn't have doubted myself. Okay. Anyway, so your homework it's going to be a little bit further. I mean, longer than normal. I apologize. This is completely my fault. I was supposed to give you a reading assignment the week that you had your test, and I didn't because I forgot. So I have to catch you up. So instead of 2 chapters, we're reading 4. I apologize for that, but I need to get us caught up so that we don't get so far ahead of the reading that you're reading about something that we've already discussed and we've moved past. So the homework assignment for tonight is, for this week is, that's the wrong, Christian Roman Empire, 11 through 14, 11 and 12, 13 and 14, those 4 chapters. And we will be caught up and we'll go back down to only having a couple chapters a week after that. Okay. All right, guys. That is going to do it for tonight. Thank you again for coming. And we will hopefully see see all of you next week.